Hi, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your aviation outlook for Alaska coming up here for Monday into Tuesday of next week. As of this Sunday, later morning, we're watching a few areas of low pressure. Generally speaking, mid-upper levels of the atmosphere, we just have a broad area of low pressure, trough of low pressure over the region. And at the surface, a number of low pressure systems. There will be a low that moves up from the lower central Gulf up to the northern Gulf Coast as we go through Monday. Another low south of Nunavik Island will skirt Kuskokwim Bay and move into Bristol Bay as we go into Monday night and Tuesday. And then a low takes shape over the lower Chukchi Sea, pushing back toward the west along the Russian coast in the same time frame. IFR conditions are anticipated, though, with a pretty good feed of moisture, some heavier precipitation, rainfall along the coast there with Prince William Sound, Cordova, Cape Suckling. Up in the mountains, some heavier snow, Wrangell, St. Elias. And then as we go further north and west, IFR conditions anticipated due to some lower cloudiness and areas of fog, a little light precipitation there along the Arctic, northwest Arctic coastline. Off of the southwest coast, Etolan Strait, Nunavik Island, westward to north of St. Paul through St. Matthew, and then out along the central and western Aleutians for Monday afternoon. There could even be a rumble of thunder up here in the upper Copper River Basin south of the Alaska Range. Again, pretty good feed of moisture, moderate to locally heavier rain possible along the northern Gulf Coast. And areas further west, widespread IFR, Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Bay, along the southwest lower YK deltas on up through the lower Bering Strait. Perhaps isolated thunder also out here in the southwest Bering. North of the western Aleutians. For Tuesday morning, we're looking at IFR conditions along the inner coastal mountains of the inner channels there of the Panhandle, northeastern Gulf Coast, outer western coast there of the Panhandle, as well as areas up through southwest along especially the Bristol Bay side of the Alaska Peninsula, and also IFR conditions in through areas of the Chukchi Sea coming into around Point Hope. And for Tuesday afternoon, we see IFR conditions along the inner coastal mountains here of the Panhandle, as well as along areas of the Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula, on up into the west arm of the Alaska Range, mainly on the south and east side. Down here through Bristol Bay, north side of the Alaska Peninsula, including St. Paul, St. Matthew. Also IFR along the Bering Strait, lower Chukchi Sea, and then coming back inland around Utqiagvik along the central Arctic coast. So past conditions for Monday, Anaktuvik Pass, generally MVFR conditions will hold throughout the day as they will at Adigan Pass there up through the central Brooks Range. And then further south and west in the lower western portion of the Alaska Range, MVFR at Lake Clark and Merrill, as well as Rainy Pass. Windy Pass will likely start out IFR on Monday, giving way to MVFR conditions, though IFR conditions could persist further south of the entrance there in the Talkeetna Mountains. And then further east, Isabel Pass, generally MVFR conditions. Can't rule out isolated rumble of thunder there, especially in through the upper Copper River Basin. Mentasta Pass should see MVFR conditions, maybe trying to become VFR there by midday into the afternoon, but otherwise MVFR conditions will persist further south of Mentasta Pass. And right now, Tanita Pass looks socked in with IFR conditions. And as I mentioned, some of that heavier precipitation occurring in the coastal mountains as well as along the northeastern Gulf Coast. Portage Pass will be socked in with IFR on Monday, with some heavier precipitation there out along the east entrance, extending eastward toward Cordova. And for the far northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White, generally MVFR conditions are expected there during the day on Monday. Freezing levels aloft. We still have a lot of warm air up here into Canada, especially central northern Canada. Freezing levels above 12,000 feet. Back further west, though, we have a broad area of low pressure in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere. The circulation generally like this. cooler pool of air aloft, freezing levels at or below 2,000 feet, vicinity of the northern Bering and around St. Lawrence Island. Ahead of it, that low that's going to be lifting up toward the northern Gulf as we go through the day on Monday. Ahead of it, freezing levels bump up 10 to even a bit above 12,000 feet there in the North Pacific, just south of the Gulf. And then generally south of the Aleutian chain, freezing levels are above 10,000 feet, bumping upwards to near 12,000 feet. Greatest threat for icing will be associated with the precipitation associated with the low that'll be lifting up into the northern Gulf on Monday. Generally, though, above 10,000 feet, the greatest threat for some considerable moderate icing there in the vicinity of the northeastern Gulf and parts of the southern Panhandle. Farther north, there could also be some icing above 8,000 feet here along the Arctic coast, Brooks Range, especially vicinity there up toward Utqiagvik and then back toward the Bering Sea. We're seeing freezing levels a bit lower, so icing could be above 5,000 feet there from around St. Lawrence back towards St. Matthew, and then generally above 8,000 feet, the central Bering Sea and areas of Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, including the southwest coast and Kuskokwim Bay. Upper level winds are strongest behind me, but ahead of the general circulation that you're seeing here, this low pressure circulation in the upper atmosphere, some 60, 70 knot plus winds generally out of the southwest or south across the mainland. Behind me, though, the jet core, 130 to 135 knot jet max out of the northwest from the far southwestern Bering across the central Aleutians into the North Pacific. At 700 millibars, we see south-southwesterly flow across the Panhandle into British Columbia, 35 to 45 knots. Lighter winds back here toward the mainland, and then behind me, a core of some stronger winds across the far western Aleutians, 45 to near 55 knots out of the northwest associated with that jet core aloft. And then at 3,000 feet, there are some stronger winds along areas of the northeastern Gulf Coast in through the Panhandle down toward British Columbia. There 40 to locally 45 to 50 knot winds from the southwest on Monday. And then behind me, again, a broad belt of winds from the lower Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, 35 to 45 knots, and then back out north of the western Aleutians. We're looking at northwesterly winds on the order of 35 to near 40 knots. The greatest threat of turbulence way in the far west, surface to 3,000 feet in the western Aleutians, eastern Aleutians into the southern tip there of the Alaska Peninsula, surface to 4,000 feet, some considerable moderate turbulence possible on Monday. And then as I step further here out of the way, a broad area of moderate turbulence possible along the northern, northeastern Gulf Coast, outer and inner areas of the Panhandle, surface to 6,000 feet. If you are able to get out, have a safe flight.